Our last webinar, Randi, was on the U.S. Constitution and civic ideals, why voting matters in every election. And we got into some great conversations about the challenges of teaching this election right now.
Great. I've been looking forward to this this particular book club since we started our book clubs. We asked Heather Cox Richardson about 6 months ago if she would do our last one before the election. We are 16 days before the last day you can actually vote. I think it's 17 days, right? You can actually vote by November 5th, but given that most states have early voting, most states, there's lots of people who are voting right now. But we wanted to do this before the election with one of the most consequential, in my view, the most consequential American historian, a contemporary American historian, who opines literally every day about what we are seeing. So for those of you who don't read her letters every night, Heather Cox Richardson is a professor of history at Boston College. She's written about the Civil War, Reconstruction, the Gilded Age, the American West, and award-winning books on subjects that stretch from the European settlement of the North American continent to the history of the Republican Party through the Trump administration. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Guardian, amongst other outlets. I am reading it because I would so fangirl. I'd spend more time doing that than actually doing the questions and answers. We said that this book club today was going to be focused on democracy awakening, notes on the state of America, and the Washington Post has called Democracy Awakening one of the 50 best nonfiction books of 2023 for anyone who is concerned about not only civics in America, but about America. I would say that that is essential reading, but also for those of you who don't do this, Heather, virtually every night, I don't know what time you write it every night. I seem to get it hits me in my inbox around midnight, but it is called Letters from an American. And so I just want to say welcome to our book club, Heather, and thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, I'm so pleased to be here.
So let me ask you just a couple of questions first. You started, in some ways, just like Tim Snyder wrote his essay on tyranny on Facebook first. That's what I remember reading. But how did you go from, why did you decide to write an essay every day on Facebook? And then how did you go from Facebook to Substack? And what spurred you on to doing this?
So it never occurred to me to do anything like what I'm doing. What happened was, it was the summer of 2019, and I had been writing on Facebook about once a week, a series of essays for about 22,000 people, because I love to write. I guess that must be obvious by now. And on September 15th, I was moving, and I was teaching back in Boston. I'm married to somebody here in Maine, but we were about to move, and in order to get out of my old house, it needed paint around the windows and windowsills. And so I was painting, and of course it was September, so the yellow jackets were out, and I got stung by a yellow jacket, and I'm allergic, and I did not have my EpiPen.
Oh, so, no.
Yeah, exactly. So instead of getting on the road to drive back to Boston, as I needed to do to teach the next day, I decided to see how bad I was going to react. We live sort of in the middle of nowhere, and I didn't want to drive anywhere. And as long as I had nothing to do but swell, I thought I would write a note to do my usual essay, because it had been several months since I'd done one. And I wrote about what the country looked like to me on that day. And one of the things that had happened was that we knew we had a letter from then chair of the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff, to then acting director of national intelligence, Robert McGuire, saying, we know there's been a whistleblower about something that happened, and you by law were supposed to bring it to us in the intelligence community, and you did not. Instead, you took it to the DOJ, and that suggests to us that it's about a principal, somebody high up in the administration. Hand that sucker over. And it was not I'm paraphrasing, but not by much.
Right.
And I recognized that as the first time a member of the legislative branch had accused somebody in the executive branch of violating a specific law. So I wrote about that, and I was just swamped with questions about it. And I thought, well, I'm not going to write 2 nights in a row because that's really flooding the zone and nobody wants to hear from anybody every night. So I didn't write on the 16th, but then I wrote again on the 17th, and I've written every night since. And what's important about that, I think, is it's really not me. It's really the questions that people ask, the community that we're building, that is, I won't say it dictates what I do, but there is no doubt, like, for example, tonight, I've started tonight's letter, and I really, really, really want to write about the Farm Bill, which not enough people know about, and it's really important, and it's tied into modern politics. But the real issue on the table in the United States today, because each letter is designed to be a snapshot of one day, and my cutoff is midnight Eastern, the real story is that the Republican candidate for president has lost it, and he's being protected by the leaders of the Republican Party. And that's, I actually spent the day, there's a quotation I want from Eisenhower, and I can't find it anywhere. If anybody wants to give me a heads up, because you know where it is, please tell me. I'm looking for what he said about a general in World War I who did not know he was incapacitated and sent people to their deaths. I think it might have been Pershing. I think it's in his memoirs of the years in the White House, because this is why he backed the legislation that later on became the 25th Amendment to the Constitution. But I've spent all day trying to find that, because that's our story today, not the Farm Bill. So that's what I do.
So I know that there are, amongst the almost 200 people who are watching us right now, I am sure we will get in the chat a couple of sources for you, because that's who my members are.
Well, that's what I figure. And it seems like it should be in Crusade in Europe, but I don't think he talked about it then. I think he talked about it in when he was in the White House, because he has that memo with Nixon. I've got the memo with Nixon. That's easy, but I swear it was there, and I just can't find it.
So, but part of what you just said, which is so, and you're such a fantastic writer, so you can do this. I yearn to be that good in writing. But part of what you just said was, and this I think is part of the strength of what you do, is that you can take a contemporary issue, see it through the lens of some historical context, and write about it in such clear language that you just have to read your letter once and understand exactly what it's saying. Most of us, mere mortals, you have to read things 2 or 3 times to understand what we're saying. And so how did you, I know this is a little far afield, but how did you become that good a writer and understand you come from academia, but you write in a way that is like the best pundits of America?
Well, thank you very much for that. I will say that I have had very good teachers. I think my real leap in writing, my first book, I think was very good. My advisor won 2 Pulitzers, and he was really had his hands all over that. No one remembers that book, but it's a good book. But then I had, when I wrote.
Tell us which one it is.
The first one is The Greatest Nation of the Earth, which is about Republican economic policies. But the fourth one, on the Wounded Knee Massacre, I had a fabulous editor on that, and she pointed out that I was always very good at topic sentences and then explaining, but I didn't have the transition sentence between that topic sentence and the paragraph. So I had to learn that there. And what I have learned over the course of writing these letters, and they're quite deliberately letters, because I feel that I am much more articulate in that person-to-person relationship than I am when I'm trying to expound. So there's a distance in a book that there isn't necessarily in letters. And that's not true of the latest book, Democracy Awakening, because in that one, that was just letters to my friends, basically. But one of the things that I think I have learned to do over the more than 2 million words I've put into the Letters from an American, and you can see this if you remember the one on the bombing of the girls in the church.
Yes.
I worked on that not for days. I worked on that for probably 12 to 15 hours. And what I found in that, and I have there's somebody who's reading I really trust. And I was very concerned because I felt as if I hadn't made the point that I wanted to. And what she said was that you let the story make its own point. You told the story and it spoke for itself. And I think that was a really big leap in my writing. So I do try and shift things around so that people aren't reading the same style every night. Like tonight's a little bit different than, sometimes I try and I play around with the order and all kinds of stuff. But learning to let the story speak for itself is something, one of the great writers I love is Willa Cather and also Ernest Hemingway. That's my style. E.B. White is one of my all-time heroes. And one of the things that they do is they, rather like Laura Ingalls Wilder did, they have quite simple sentences that mean that you don't have to do intellectual work to unpack a sentence. So when you read Laura Ingalls Wilder, for example, you never get stuck in her words. But what that does is it leaves your mind free to understand what's actually being said. And that's what the editor from Wounded Knee taught me. That's what I think I'm learning through this. And it's funny because it's not deliberate style at all. It is basically letting people see what's in my head. And a friend of mine years ago, I was not a good writer, and he is quite a good writer. And he just started writing something one day. And I said, how do you do that? Like, how do you do that? You don't have an outline. You don't, you're just writing. And he said, can't you hear the music? And I said, what music? No, I can't hear the music. Now I can hear the music. And what you see on the page is the music. And if you listen to me read, because I read the letters every day they call it a podcast. There's a rhythm to it. And I the pauses are mine, because I could hear it. And if I come in too fast or if I do something too slow, I break up the music. And that's, honestly, people, I hope so. For me, what it has given me is that I can hear the music.
Well, I think, and I know I'm going to delve into a couple of questions on the civitas in a second, but I think for our audience, the what you just said is so incredible, because teachers, it is what people hear. It's not what we say that really matters. And so often educators, when educators first start, how many times have I given the advice, or have others given the advice that, you meet people where they are. And if you write in a way that is understandable and clear, and you hear the music as opposed to seeing the words, it makes it easier, I think, to debunk misinformation and disinformation. And in some ways, as awful as I personally believe Trump is, he has learned in his own way, through his years of entertainment, how to communicate in a way that people hear him. And so I think that this is really, I'm dwelling on this a bit because I find it remarkable to every day read your letters and to now I will do it with listening for the story, even as I'm reading it.
So I think Trump used to be able to reach his listeners, and I was fascinated by him in 2016 because he seemed to me to be holding up a mirror to a certain portion of the American population and showing them what they wanted to see. Because he was never a politician. He was always a salesman, and he was an excellent salesman. But one of the things that people like me said who watched him in the years in which he was not center stage, because really he was pretty tightly wrapped after he became president, except for the COVID press conferences every day. And those went so poorly, they pulled him out of those. And then he, after President Joe Biden took office, Trump basically sat at Mar-a-Lago or did rallies with handpicked, people who were there voluntarily. One of the things that people like me were watching was the fact he was deteriorating. Yes. And you could see that he was deteriorating. And when he did that debate with Biden in September, or whenever it wasn't September.
June.
I've lost June. I thought one of the reasons that people were so horrified by how Biden looked was because they were horrified by how bad Trump looked and were concerned that Biden would not be strong enough to take him down. And one of the things I think you see now is that he's lost all inhibitions and he's lost the ability to read his audience. So he goes back, the thing that always gets him a good applause is when he goes, sort of viciously anti-trans people, which he always kind of relies on late in his speech. But, the other night when he went on at great length about Arnold Palmer and ended up with a really raunchy ending, nobody went to that to hear 12 or 15 minutes on Arnold Palmer, who is just not significant to his audience any longer. He no longer is able to read that audience or to have that language. And this is one of the reasons I think that he's not the same man he was in 2016. No. And in 2016, he's not the same man he was in the 1980s. When you love him or hate him, he was entertaining. He listened to him on a talk show. He could make a sentence. He could create an image, and he can no longer create an image of anything except, he can't really do anything. I mean, he sounds rather like your elderly relative with dementia.
I thought what President Obama said about him this week at one of his speeches, I think it was the Arizona speech, where he likened him to, worrying about somebody's grandpa, I thought made a very important point in a way people could hear it. But I'm sorry, you go.
If it were you, or me or anybody else, if your relative was acting that way, you would intervene in some fashion. Right. You would not Velcro the person to the wall in hopes that they would stay up there long enough to put you in power. And that's the piece that I find, I'm always interested in the long sweep of history. And, when I was watching him this week, I thought, this is why I was into Eisenhower. Eisenhower was very aware of what happened when you had a leader who did not recognize that he was no longer in control. People died. And this is why he was so adamant that the United States must have a system for advising somebody to say, you are not okay. And of course, this is my beef right now with the leadership of the Republican Party, because somebody has got to say this man is not okay before he gets the nuclear codes.
So why do you think, and I want to just make sure our audience understands, I read that you were an Abraham Lincoln Republican. Did I read that correctly?
You did, and a conservative.
So I just want to make sure that whoever is listening understands that, what Heather just said. So what do you think? Why do you think the current Republican apparatus is doing it? Is it strictly power, or is there some other reason for it?
Well, that's a really complicated question because there's the long view, there's the shorter view, and there's today's view. So when I say I'm a Lincoln Republican and a conservative, what I mean is I am a conservative in the mold of Abraham Lincoln. And what that means, because conservatism has a long, quite illustrious history, really. And in Lincoln's day, the elite slaveholders tried to say that those people like Lincoln, who were trying to uphold the idea of the Declaration of Independence, were radicals. And that was a negative thing. And Lincoln stood up in the late 1850s and he said, now hang on just a minute. You're the ones who are trying to overthrow democracy. You know, we're the conservative ones. We're the ones who are standing on the Declaration of Independence, the idea that everybody should be treated equally before the law and have a right to a say in their government. And of course, he didn't mean women. He didn't mean indigenous Americans. He barely meant Black people. But those concepts, protecting those concepts of American democracy, were in his mind conservative. And that's who I am. I'm a conservative who cares about the principles of American democracy. And those are principles that the Republicans stood on forever. Now, what happened to that in the longer term is that a small faction of Americans wanted to get rid of the New Deal government that was put in place by FDR and the Democrats beginning in 1933, but that became adopted by both parties. So Eisenhower takes that New Deal government and makes it the middle way government, slightly different. But the idea is that the federal government should regulate business, provide a basic social safety net, promote infrastructure, and protect civil rights. Now, they argued around the edges of what that looked like, but both parties agreed to that. Now, a group of people who disagreed with that and wanted to take the country back to the 1920s began to call themselves conservatives in order to stand against those that they called liberals. And by that, they meant everybody, Republican and Democratic both, who adhered to that new form of government. But they weren't conservatives. And even when they articulated that, people at the time, Republicans at the time, were like, you guys are nuts. You're like crazy radicals. Right. But they became known as movement conservatives because it was the name of their political movement. It was not ideological conservatism. It was the name of a movement. That movement is the one that grew to take over the Republican Party, first under Reagan and then under George W. Bush. George H.W. Bush was a traditional Republican, George W. Bush. And then that went forward until Trump used the kind of rhetoric that they had used, saying that Democrats, people of color, Black people, women were communists or socialists trying to destroy America, to take office. And once he did that, he turned that into a movement, into what we now know as a fascist movement. And so we have with the longer term, that shorter term, and now with him having taken over the Republican Party, the people who adhere to it now, you can see a lot of Republicans don't. They're jumping ship and they're saying we're going to vote for Kamala Harris in this election. But a lot of people who are still supporting him are doing so partly out of fear, I think, definitely for power. And what that power means, I think, depends on who you're looking at, because the injection of Peter Thiel and Elon Musk into this election, largely thanks to J.D. Vance, is really frightening. You've got billionaires there who have openly said they do not believe in democracy. They believe they should be given a free hand to shape the future without the muddiness of democracy. And frankly, I don't think they've done a very good job at what they've turned their hand to so far. So there's a lot going on here in the leadership. Then, of course, the people are something else altogether.
So just even in terms of unpacking that, because I think those of us who actually teach civics, you could see what Eisenhower did. You could actually see what Nixon did. You could forget the corruption for a second. Just even thinking about the EPA. And the Environmental Protection, the EPA, you can see, you could see who was building on the New Deal and who was diverging from it in terms of FDR versus Reagan. I think that the what's confusing now is, even if you didn't have the lies, the kind of political alchemy right now is confusing, because conservative is not conservative, progressive may not be progressive, but there does seem to be, and maybe it's because of, it was interesting, the NBC polling results today. I found it fascinating that we have gotten back to the democracy argument of, and you go through that and the dangers of Trump or this new conservative movement or this new Thiel, AI, Musk, power, whatever they are, movement. But I found it fascinating that the majority of people in America said they would be less inclined to vote for someone who believed that Donald Trump won the election in 2020. Does that give you any hope for the future, or is it still too muddled?
Well, it's hard for me to see it as muddled simply because it's so very clear to me, and
right.
and simply because these people have said what they're doing. I mean, Ronald Reagan was very clear that he intended to take the country back to an earlier era in which there would not be the government regulations that we'd had and the safety net that we'd had and the infrastructure that we'd had and the protection of civil rights, for the simple reason that once he gets in office, or once he rises to office, he's embracing this idea of what he called supply side economics. And that idea is that instead of feeding people at the bottom in the middle of our society, that is having the government work on providing opportunity and jobs to enable people at the bottom in the middle to have the funds to fuel the economy, that's the demand side, that he was going to focus on the supply side, which was to put the money and the power into people at the very top so that they would be able in turn to focus on the markets efficiently and invest in the United States in such a way that the economy would grow. Well, the problem with that is that, and there's plenty of economic research on this now, it never worked. You know, economic growth was never better under that system than it was under the old system. And in fact, what happened is that $50 trillion moved from the bottom 90% to the top 1% in America. So they continue to say that tax cuts are going to fuel the economy, but it's not real. It's never happened that way. So there's that piece of things going on. But one of the other things I think in this moment, when you talk about things being muddy, is that in 1960, there was an article written by a guy named Phil Converse, very important to political scientists. And what he said is that everybody agrees on democracy. We're all agreed on this. So there's no point in talking about it anymore. What you really got to do is nail together coalitions by promising different groups different stuff. And that's how you're going to get elected. And then you can put your flavor of this liberal consensus, this idea that the government should do those four things, into effect. You can cut some regulations here or add some regulations or mess around with the tax structure, but really we are all agreed on that. And what happened is I think both Democrats and Republicans stopped talking about democracy and began to talk about coalitions. But the group that continued to talk about big picture items was that faction of movement conservatives who wanted to say, let's get rid of all that government, because the lesson that we are going to carry forward is the idea of the individual fighting against the empire. We're going to get rid of that behemoth state that does those things we don't like and really pump up the idea of individualism. And it is no accident that 1977 is Star Wars, and the Han Solo and Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia against the Empire, and Reagan is elected in 1980. That myth, that idea of individualism, I think has completely muddied what's happening, because people still cling to that myth and not reality. And where that has taken us is where we are in the present, where you have people really believing that the federal government is, the deep state, is, unelected bureaucrats, all these people who are theoretically stopping individuals from living how they wish, when in fact, the state that they are trying to destroy is the only thing that is doing things like stopping price gouging and protecting wages and so on. So I think partly if there is muddiness, it is because of the power of this myth and the power of the right-wing media that since at least 1996 with the Fox News channel has pressed this myth as reality. And, you know, reality took a long time to catch on. I think now there's a number of us pushing back against the myth with actual facts. But boy, we've got two generations of people who think that the government is bad.
And how do you, so, you know, before we take questions from the audience, how now then, I mean, it begs my next question, which is Project 2025, you know, basically takes movement conservatism and, you know, puts it in stark relief for 900 pages. So, but one of the things it does is it says there should be no Department of Education. We should close it. And, you know, there are a bunch of people who say, oh, great, get rid of the bureaucracy. But then when they find out what it really means, they're like, no, we don't want to get rid of Title I and Pell and IDEA and whatever. But think about what Trump just did yesterday or this week when he said two things, both of which I've been dying to ask you about. One was, you know, he would have settled the Civil War, not fought it, but settled it. That one, I thought you'd be able to opine about a whole lot more than me. But the second was, we went from, oh, we're closing the Department of Education to the fascistic, I'm controlling schools, and anyone who doesn't do what I deem right, I'm going to take money away from. So my question to you is, it does feel like they say this myth that they don't want, you know, government, but it feels like they're weaponizing government against the people, a la the Dobbs case, a la what he said on Friday.
Well, yes. So movement conservatism was all about getting rid of the government. They wanted to get rid of the regulations and the taxes and the protections for civil rights and infrastructure and so on. What Trump and his people did, I mean, in order to get for the traditional Republicans after 1980 or so, in order to stay in office, they recognized that they needed the votes of sexists and racists, basically. And those sexists included the traditionalist Republicans, largely out of the Southern Baptists, but not exclusively there. But they never intended for those people to be in the driver's seat. They were the people who provided the votes. And again, there's actually literally a memo about this. What happens is that Trump recognizes after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in August of 2017, that those are his base. You know, by trying to split the baby there, he lost a lot of the more traditional Republicans. And so he decided to go with that base of sexists and racists. And he put them in the driver's seat. And what they want, especially the white evangelical Christians on his team, what they want is a strong government that is going to enforce Christian nationalism. So get rid of LGBTQ plus rights, to say a family is a man, a woman, and children, which, by the way, is a really post-World War II concept in America. Families have never looked like that. Right. They're going to enforce a certain kind of religion and so on. So that's something that's a very weird thing, and it's actually causing a split in the party itself, because if you're a business person like the people who run the cruise lines in Florida or who are running Walt Disney, the whole Disney empire, you don't want a religious government saying you can't have LGBTQ plus people at your resort. You just don't, or you can't have LGBTQ plus workers on your cruise ships, because it's going to hurt your business. So the idea of a government that's going to enforce these things is actually a bit contrary to what the party looked like until about 2021. But the issue of education, I think, is absolutely vital. And to step back a little bit, if you looked at the curriculum that Florida Governor Ron DeSantis put in place, it got so much grief because it basically wiped out Black Americans and Indigenous Americans were totally out the window. A few Asian Americans were in there, as I recall, and Oklahoma did something very similar. What really jumped out to me about that curricula was that for all that it erased different groups of people, what it really erased was agency. Just completely erased agency, so that there was no way for people to look at our history and say that ordinary people had a say in it. And that idea of controlling our history, not just by who we erase, but also by creating a vision in which there was a perfect past. In the case of Donald Trump's 1776 project, they really say that the nation was perfect when it was formed, like it sprang out of George Washington's head, right? It formed, and it could be perfect again. It's always been perfect. Things like slavery didn't matter. That was like, slavery was generally good, and maybe there was a few bad people. And certainly the race riots that caused such destruction in places like Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. Those were just a few bad people, but the good people, the good white people, stopped that sort of thing in its tracks. But what jumps out about that is that's what I would call authoritarian history, because it was a perfect past that he is promising a strong man can take us back to, so long as those people who are standing in the way get wiped out. And that's very different than our true democratic history, which is all about regular people having agency. And the whole point of a democracy is it's never finished. There's never an end. It's always the means. And the means depend on individual people feeling as if they have agency and taking a stand for their rights. And so when he talks about, we're not going to give any money to people who talk about, the history of slavery on stolen land. Well, what you're saying is we're not going to have a portrait of true history that will empower the people in a democracy. We're going to force feed them a sanitized version of history that is an authoritarian history. And I have to say, I am a huge booster of America. I really believe in American democracy. But it is vital, if you believe in that American democracy and love it as I do, that I am so short on sleep I can't begin to tell you, that you tell all of it. Because unless you tell all of it, you lose that agency of all those people who don't make it into Donald Trump's version. So I think he's playing with fire. I don't think he understands those theories, but it's like it's gaslighting on a national scale, taking our history and telling us it's something that it wasn't.
Well, you just said something, and I'm being given all the questions that people are asking, and I'm trying within my questions to kind of bundle them. But you just said something that just turned the light bulb on for me about agency. Think about three things. The labor movement is agency for workers. Public education and access to college is agency for young people. Remember what Trump also just said in the last few days, that he is the protector of women. So it is this kind of intentional disconnect of the agency that Biden often says is bottom up and inside out. And I think that the through line that you just said, at least for me, that's starting to see why they have put all of these things together in a package to try to say, oh no, it's only the strong man who's going to have the power, and the rest of you have nothing except for listening to the strong man. That's what I'm hearing you say, and that makes sense to me now. Thank you.
Yes, it does. And I think one of the things that always jumps out to me is that Trump rose through reality TV. And when they first pioneered reality TV in Europe, somebody who reviewed it literally called it fascist TV, because there was no cooperation. The whole point was to be the top person at the end of the day, and be the one who controlled everything. And that was a moment for sure in American pop culture, but it has never been the reality of the way human beings interacted. And in fact, the guy, Mark Burnett, who brought reality TV to America, really loved the book Lord of the Rings. I'm sorry, Lord of the Flies, not Lord of the Rings.
Lord of the Flies.
Although Lord of the Rings is involved too, but Lord of the Flies, Golding's book. And there was a real example of 6 schoolboys who got marooned for 15 months on a desert island. And you know what they did? They divided up the work in teams. They figured out a system in which when they started quarreling, they would stop the quarrels. They had religious services, and one guy fell and broke his leg, and they set his leg and did his work for him so that everybody after 15 months was healthy, and they had created a positive society. That was the reality. Lord of the Flies was a commentary on World War II. And I just think it's so interesting that really became the backbone of the reality TV that gave us the image of Donald Trump.
Right. So we are coming to a close, and I have to ask you the most, I guess it is for our audience, they want me to ask you what happens if we lose, but I want to ask you how in the next 16 days, you've rekindled in me this kind of fight for media literacy, for experiential learning, for project-based learning, to turn our schools to be much more about problem solving and critical thinking and relationship building and resilience, as opposed to teach to the test. That will be a whole nother story. But how in the next 16 days do we educate about the dangers of what Trump is doing right now?
Just quickly, I'm not even going to think about what happens if he wins. I will say to people who are teaching, especially teaching civics or history, one of the reasons I dive into history the way I do is, perfectly well. So today, for example, if I talk about Trump's mental capacities, I'm going to make a lot of people really angry. But if I talk about Eisenhower and what Eisenhower did, they can hear that. And that's one of the things that history does for us, is it enables us to step back and say, this is not about you in this moment. This is about how people have handled obstacles in our past. And that may be a very good place for people to be in the future if things go a certain way. In the meantime, in the next 16 days, what everybody will tell you is there's nothing more powerful than reaching out to your friends and talking to them about this election. You're not going to change minds at this point, but what you are going to do is motivate people to vote who might not otherwise do so. If you're interested, a number of different places, Indivisible, States, the States Project, and especially Red, Wine, and Blue, have relational organizing tools that will not give your friends information to anybody but you, but they will, at least the Red, Wine, and Blue thing is called Rally, but it will remind you to text them, to engage with them. These are people who are registered to vote, but maybe don't always do so. This is going to be a turnout election, and the people who have the highest turnout are going to win. The Democrats know that when they get high turnout, they win. But the problem is Democrats do not tend to vote at the same rate that Republicans do. And in this election, all the way down the ballot, as far as I'm concerned, I'm not even going to say that. It's not about partisanship. This is a place where everybody should be comfortable, as in protecting our democracy. Right. And the thing about that is, speaking of history, this is our moment. This is our chance to protect the same things that our forebears did, to protect the right to have a say in our government and the right to be treated equally before the law, and to stand with, Fannie Lou Hamer and Abraham Lincoln. And for all that we're scared, and I certainly am, it's also an extraordinary gift and an opportunity to be able to put our names into history alongside those great heroes who put everything on the line to save the concept of human self-determination. So I'd say, I'm not leaving. I'm not taking anything off the field between now and November 5th.
Are you confident that let me ask it this way. Do you believe that our democracy can be preserved if Donald Trump wins again?
No, we will lose it. Not forever. People don't look at Germany, for example. We will recover it, but not in my lifetime, not in your lifetime.
Right.
And this is not, sometimes people think people like me are being alarmist. He literally has said so. He's
Right.
going to go after his enemies. He's going to make the military and the Department of Justice and the civil service all subservient to him in the same way that people like Russian President Vladimir Putin has done. Or a better example, Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, has done, in which he took a democracy and essentially destroyed the opposition by making it impossible for the opposition to have media, by arranging elections, but they were all rigged, by taking over businesses, for example, making people sell out for pennies on the dollar to give factories to his cronies. That is what we would expect to see here in the United States. But unlike in Hungary, if you own the United States, as it wouldn't really be Trump because he's not going to make it, J.D. Vance and the people with whom he works will do, you control the most important, I always say real estate, but I don't mean the land, the most important country in the world. Right. And I just worry that people don't recognize just how bad things could get and how quickly they can get that bad. So I hope everybody is, don't go to bed afraid. We're all going forward with as much enthusiasm and excitement as we can, because if we win this election, think of what we could build on the other side and what we could take on, climate change and disease and inequality and migration and all the things that we're really going to have to grapple with successfully in the 21st century to keep the globe on track. That we get to do if we get past November 5th.
So let me ask you one other question before, and as I said, Kelly is giving me all these questions because I'm like, I've wanted to just watch you as we're talking, so I haven't scrolled down. But let me ask you one other question, which is going to be, what question did I not ask you that I should have? But I want to do it with this prelude. Heather and I have not had this conversation before. And those of you who are my members in the AFT, you have seen that I and the other officers have basically been on a bus from Labor Day to Election Day. We've done over 100 events. We will probably do in the next 16 days another 30 or 40, if not more. And it is about engaging with people. It's about getting the vote out. It's about answering people's questions. It's about ensuring that the stakes of this election are known and doing the relational organizing that unions are known for. And our members overwhelmingly understand this and are voting for, if any of our polling or any of our seeing thousands of people as I have since Labor Day mean anything. People are getting out and voting, and they understand the stakes of this election in so many different ways. I think it's really remarkably wonderful that you, in a whole different community, have come to the same view about this election as we have in terms of what to do. And I hope for the people who are listening, voting is more important than anything else. Understanding the stakes and what the issues are really important. If you want to have agency over our lives, over your life, over your family's life, let's educate ourselves and let's get out to vote and vote by November 5th. So Heather, is there a question that I should have asked you that I didn't, other than saying thank you and making sure that people read this amazing book or read your letters? What didn't I ask you in this last hour that I should have?
Well, I don't know how you could have asked this, but one of the things that I think is really important in this moment and that I find fascinating, many things I find fascinating, but I do think there's a movement underway. You know, when I first started writing the letters 5 years ago now, I got letters all the time from people saying, I'm so scared. I don't know, what are they going to do to me? I don't get those letters anymore. I ran for school board, didn't make it, but I'm supporting the candidate who did because we're going to push back against Moms for Liberty. Or I've turned out a whole squad of people to vote. Or I'm writing letters to my Congress people and they're appearing in the newspapers. I think that we are the first generation of Americans, especially American women, who have 20 to 30 years after our children are out of the house or after we've gotten to where we want in our careers, in which we have skills and we have friends and we have knowledge and we have sometimes we have money and we have a real opportunity to create the kind of world we want to see. And because of who we are, I think that we have largely been invisible. And people are not necessarily taking note of the people like you and me who are out there with these giant communities of people trying to make the world a better place. And I think that movement, which really doesn't show up in the legacy media, is going to be hugely important in this election and afterward, because if in fact Harris gets elected and we actually get Democratic House and Senate, there's a lot of rebuilding to do in every possible field. And we can't just quit on November 6th and say, well, as you know, we're done. We've accomplished what we wanted to. There's a lot of rebuilding that's got to happen. And that movement of people, not just of that seed I talked about, but the whole group of people who've come together in the last year at least, because the organizing was much deeper than that, I think is making a huge difference in this country. And I think it just has not gotten the attention that it could warrant. I kind of like that we've been invisible, but it's a little astonishing to me that there isn't more attention to it. I see again and again the legacy media making a big deal about some influencer or other and saying, oh, this person has these huge numbers of followers. And I can sit here and I can tick off at least 5 older women who have numbers that are significantly higher than that have never been featured in those places. So I think that there's a movement underway. And for all that the world looks scary, I think that a lot of people might be surprised by what happens on November 5th.
There was an article this morning in the 19th that talked about a group of people that may be deciding this election, which is women over 50. And to your point, I just can't tell you how grateful we are for your time, for your spirit, for your intellect, and for making it accessible to people each and every day. It takes more than a minute to do those letters. And I do actually love the days that you say, just look at this beautiful, gorgeous skyline or a cloud formation or water in Maine, because then I know you're taking a minute for yourself. But you are a national treasure and you are an AFT treasure. And anytime there is an open invitation, anytime you want to speak to 1.8 million members of our union, we would love to have you. Thank you so much, Heather Cox Richardson, for joining us tonight. And for those of you who have not read her letters or this book, please, it's remarkable. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I'm going to take you up on that because there's a history of the Department of Education in the 1860s that most people don't know, and I'm dying to tell it. So let's plan for that after November 5th.
We would love that. Thank you. Gracie,
thank you.
My dog says thank you.
Heather, Randi, thank you guys so much. Now I can hear my dogs barking in the background. They must hear yours. But thank you so much. It's hard for me to come on down and kind of ruin this party because it's so good. But for those of you who need professional development credit, you should be able to download that now, assuming you use and responded to some of the poll questions. And I'm going to say live right now this week, stay tuned. I will be sending everybody an email because we'll be launching a sweepstakes to win Heather Cox Richardson's book and our book authors from our earlier one with Jennifer Berkshire and Jack Snyder. So that will be something that is coming soon to an email near you. So pay attention. All right. Thank you, everybody. I hope you have a good night. Be sure to check out the links, and I think I may have some potential answers for you that you've had the folks in your earlier question that you posed, Heather. So I'll share that with you shortly.
Thank you.